An elderly black man never anticipated that his life would be suddenly ruined when two aggressive police officers charged at him, mercilessly beating him. What follows will leave you stunned as this act of brutality escalates into a greater injustice. You won't believe what happens when his son, the chief of police, arrives at the scene. Stay tuned until the end to uncover the story's unexpected twist. Leave a comment where you're watching, and don't forget to subscribe. The evening sky gradually turned a shade of red-orange, and the park seemed enveloped in a peaceful atmosphere. George Thompson, a 73-year-old black man, sat on an old wooden bench, his gaze resting quietly in the distance. He had lived a long life filled with many ups and downs. This park was his haven, a place where he could shed all worries, a private corner where he quietly faced the memories of his life. George was a reserved man who had spent many years fighting for his rights during the civil rights movement in America. He had once stood up for justice, witnessing social changes from the hardest times to the present day. Even so, he often felt that certain prejudices still lingered, like a shadow he could never fully escape. In the cool of the evening, George closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the gentle breeze on his face. He was unaware that a patrol car was approaching from afar. Only when the engine cut off and two officers stepped out did he slowly open his eyes, slightly surprised to see them heading toward him with unfriendly expressions. The two police officers, Bradley and Mitchell, quietly approached. They had been tasked with tracking down a black suspect accused of assaulting a nearby store. However, during their search, their eyes happened to land on the elderly man sitting alone, gentle in appearance but an easy, convenient target for them. "Look, an old man," Bradley said, without a hint of hesitation. "Maybe he's the perfect choice for us." Mitchell smiled in agreement, his gaze cold. "Who cares? We just need someone to arrest. They'll believe anything we say." Without waiting another moment, both men advanced quickly toward George, their faces stern and determined. The old man sensed something unusual as he saw the two officers hurrying toward him, their eyes lacking any hint of goodwill. He sat still for a moment, then tried to stay calm, straightening his back and looking at them with a hint of surprise. "Hello, old man," Bradley said coldly and distantly when they were only a few steps away. "We need you to stand up immediately." George was momentarily confused, but he kept his voice calm as he asked, "Is there something wrong, officers?" Mitchell dismissed his question. His tone was stern and abrupt. "Stand up immediately. No more questions." Slowly, George struggled to his feet, his weary legs no longer as strong as they once were. His aging body trembled slightly as he rose to face the two officers. He didn't understand what was happening, but he tried to maintain the calm he had learned over the years. "I don't understand. What's going on?" George spoke gently but firmly, hoping for some kind of answer. "You don't need to understand anything," Bradley responded coldly. Without giving the old man a chance to react, Bradley suddenly grabbed his arm, twisting it sharply behind his back. George cried out in pain, feeling a stabbing sensation in his shoulder joint from Bradley's forceful grip. "Wait, what are you doing? I haven't done anything wrong," George tried to shout, his voice shaken yet still filled with shock and indignation. "I told you to shut up," Mitchell shouted, shoving George forward, causing him to lose balance and fall hard to the ground. His frail body hit the cold ground painfully from the unexpected fall. George tried to take a deep breath to calm himself, but his heart pounded rapidly, overwhelmed with fear and confusion about why he was being treated this way. Bradley and Mitchell were unfazed by his condition. They coldly yanked him to his feet, handcuffing the elderly man with a terrifying roughness, as if he were a dangerous criminal. "Did you think you could get away with it, old man?" Bradley sneered. "We know exactly what you did." George, shocked and furious, tried to resist, but realized that none of his words would change their prejudice. To these two men, he was just a black man, an easy target to help them meet their work quotas. And, with his age and decline in health, he could do nothing but endure this injustice in silence and pain. George fell hard onto the cold ground, his arm twisted mercilessly behind him, metal handcuffs digging into his wrists, leaving him unable to move. His back ached, and his trembling legs no longer had the strength to hold him up. The only sound of resistance George could make was a faint groan, drowned out by the triumphant laughter of the two officers. His eyes searched around, hoping for someone to speak up, but all he received were silent, averted gazes. Onlookers in the park, from families to casual walkers, had all stopped, confused and disturbed by the scene unfolding before them. They saw an elderly, gentle man being treated no differently than a dangerous criminal. Some turned their heads away, unwilling to get involved or risk becoming a target of the officers, believing they could do anything with the power in their hands. But one young woman, standing at a distance, couldn't bear the sight any longer. Her heart clenched with both sorrow and anger. At that moment, she decided to act, taking out her phone to capture everything happening before her. She knew she couldn't do anything to help George directly, but she hoped this video would serve as evidence, seen by others who would speak up for him. Once the video was recorded, she quickly uploaded it to social media with a call for justice, hoping the truth would spread. At this point, George was being roughly hauled to his feet by the two officers. His frail legs couldn't hold him up, but Bradley and Mitchell didn't care. They dragged him toward the patrol car. His heart pounded in his chest, not only from physical pain but from the humiliation he was enduring. His mind was foggy, struggling to understand why he was being treated like this. Was it because of his skin color, or simply the cold indifference of prejudice? In this moment of despair, George thought of his son, Thomas, who had dedicated his life to justice and protecting the community. Thomas was George's greatest pride. He had watched his son grow from a young man full of zeal, facing countless challenges, to becoming the chief of police. George had hoped that, in that position, Thomas could bring about positive changes in the system, fostering fairness and transparency. He had once believed that people like Thomas could eradicate the discrimination and injustices he had faced. But now, George wondered if even his son could stop people like Bradley and Mitchell. Did Thomas know that his father was being subjected to such humiliation and pain? As George was consumed by his thoughts, the patrol car sped away, leaving him feeling helpless and alone. No one in the park knew that this elderly man was the father of the police chief, and George couldn't be certain that even if Thomas knew his plight, he could do anything to help. The very system Thomas had wanted to reform was now turning on his own family, treating them as outcasts. The more George thought about it, the heavier his heart grew. Despite his physical and emotional pain, George held on to a faint hope that justice would be served, that his son would uncover the truth and fight for him and all the other innocent people. But was that hope enough to help him survive the injustice he was enduring? Could the dream of justice that Thomas held help him escape this nightmare? Not far from the park was the police station where Thomas Thompson, George's son, had just finished a long day filled with meetings and paperwork. As the police chief, Thomas had a heavy responsibility to ensure the city's safety. Whenever he had a moment, he would often walk through the park near the station to relax and breathe in the fresh air before heading home. This park was also a place his father, George, frequently visited to find peace in life, and perhaps that was why Thomas always felt connected to it. As he entered the park, Thomas immediately sensed that something was wrong. From a distance, he saw a patrol car parked at the roadside, its lights flashing, with 2 police officers standing nearby. His sharp eyes quickly noticed the unusual scene. 2 officers were dragging an elderly man whose face was twisted in pain. Thomas stopped, his heart skipping a beat when he realized that the man was his father, George. Without hesitation, Thomas ran towards them, anger boiling within him. "Stop right now!" His voice rang out with authority, capturing Bradley and Mitchell's attention. They both turned around, slightly surprised to see a tall man approaching them with a serious expression. "Who are you to give us orders?" Officer Bradley asked, his tone dripping with disdain. Thomas stepped closer, his gaze cold and determined. "I'm Thomas Thompson, the police chief of this city. The man you're mistreating is my father. Release him immediately." Bradley and Mitchell glanced at each other, then laughed mockingly. Mitchell shook his head, his eyes filled with sarcasm. "Police chief? Don't mess with us. You, a guy like you, claiming to be police chief?" Thomas said nothing further. He simply took out his badge from his pocket and held it in front of them. "I'm not joking. Here's my badge. I demand you release my father immediately." But instead of stopping, the 2 officers only laughed harder. Bradley tilted his chin towards Thomas, looking defiant. "This big shot thinks flashing a badge will make us believe him?" Thomas tried to remain calm, but his anger had reached its peak. "I'm warning you, this behavior is an abuse of power and a serious violation. I won't let this go." Mitchell stepped up, his attitude even ruder and more challenging. "I don't care what badge you have. Here, we call the shots. If you don't want trouble, step aside. Otherwise, don't blame us for what happens next." Unable to bear it any longer, Thomas took another step forward, trying to prevent the 2 officers from continuing to mistreat his father. But before he could act, Mitchell grabbed his arm, twisted it behind his back, and pressed hard. Thomas groaned in pain, but he showed no sign of weakness, his gaze still firm and defiant. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice," Mitchell announced coldly. Wasting no time, Bradley swiftly took out handcuffs and restrained Thomas without hesitation. Thomas stood still, a flood of helplessness and humiliation washing over him as he was treated like a criminal simply for trying to protect his father. When George saw his son being handcuffed and dragged away, he could only let out a choked sob. His eyes were filled with worry and sorrow, painfully watching his son, the one he had always been proud of for working his way up to become the police chief, now being mistreated by the very people he had once hoped would bring about change. "Who do you think you are to interfere in our work?" Bradley sneered as he pushed Thomas toward the patrol car. Mitchell followed, smirking and shaking his head. Thomas, now handcuffed and forced to sit beside his father, tried to stay composed. He knew what they were doing was wrong, a blatant abuse of power. But the contemptuous looks and mocking laughter of the 2 officers filled him with helpless anger and frustration. "You'll pay for this," Thomas said, his voice cold and resolute. "Once we get to the station, I'll make sure you both realize the serious mistake you've made." But Bradley just smirked, looking at Thomas with a challenging glare. "Oh, we'd love to see what you'll do, Chief. All we see is a foolish guy in our way, nothing more." Mitchell shoved Thomas into the back seat of the car, then slammed the door shut. They walked up front, still laughing and talking among themselves. "Do you think this guy is the police chief?" Bradley asked, his tone still full of mockery. Probably not. Just a guy dreaming he's someone important. Mitchell laughed loudly. He doesn't realize that we're the ones who decide everything here. Sitting in the car, Thomas looked at his father, his eyes filled with apology and fury. Dad, I'm so sorry. I couldn't protect you the way I wanted to. George offered a weak smile, his eyes still holding patience and understanding for his son. It's all right, Thomas. You did everything you could. This isn't your fault. Thomas turned away, struggling to hold back his frustration. He knew that once they reached the police station, everything would come to light and these two officers would pay for their actions. But for now, sitting in the patrol car, Thomas and George could only endure the humiliation, injustice, and ridicule of the two officers, who had no idea they'd just made one of the biggest mistakes of their lives. Throughout the ride back to the station, Bradley and Mitchell relentlessly mocked and insulted Thomas and George without mercy. Do you think you're the police chief? Bradley sneered, looking back at Thomas through the glass divider with a contemptuous smirk. Chief of police? Maybe you're only a chief in your dreams. Mitchell joined in, his gaze dripping with disdain as he looked toward George. And this old man? Look at him. He's nothing but a troublemaker. Poor thing. Probably thinks he's some great victim of his time. Both officers burst out laughing, their laughter echoing in the confined space, full of smug satisfaction. Thomas sat in silence, his face rigid, eyes looking out the window as he tried to hold back the anger raging within him. He felt every insult directed at him and his father, but he knew that reacting would only embolden these two even more. Despite his fury, Thomas reminded himself to stay calm. No matter what they said, he would stand firm and face them at the station, where the truth about his identity would be revealed and these power-abusing officers would face the consequences. Besides, his son, George, also remained silent. This wasn't his first time experiencing something like this. Throughout his life, George had faced countless injustices. But this time, the pain was deeper. He wasn't just a victim of abuse of power, but also had to witness his son, whom he had hoped could change the system, caught in the same web of prejudice and injustice. Seeing Thomas trying to stay composed, George gently placed a hand on his shoulder, a light touch full of meaning. Thomas, George said softly, his voice low and filled with emotion, don't let people like them make you lose your faith. I've witnessed so much injustice in my life, but I never lost faith in justice. You've come a long way. Don't let today make you fall. Thomas looked at his father, his eyes filled with both sorrow and empathy. Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have protected you. I shouldn't have let you endure this, but I feel like everything I've worked for is meaningless against people like this. George shook his head gently, his eyes calm and forgiving. No, son. What you've done isn't meaningless. All your efforts to change this system have helped many people. Don't let one dark moment make you lose your way. People like them are just a small part of this system. You can't give up because of a few who abuse their power. As father and son exchanged these words, Bradley and Mitchell continued with their taunts. Listen to this. A moral lesson from two criminals. Bradley laughed loudly, his voice thick with sarcasm. You think you're the police chief? What a lovely dream. Thomas kept his eyes forward, unshaken. He replied calmly but firmly. You can say whatever you want, but remember, I'm not just anyone. When we reach the station, you'll realize you've made the biggest mistake of your careers. Mitchell laughed loudly, his eyes gleaming with scorn. We're so scared. A guy pretending to be the chief and an old man preaching morals. You're both hilarious, you know." Though George was exhausted and in pain, he held Thomas's hand firmly. He knew his son was dealing with men whose power had blinded them. But even in this unfortunate situation, George felt pride and love for Thomas. He reminded himself that what his son was doing meant more than any ridicule from the two men before them. Mitchell looked at George through the glass, sneering. "Hey, old man, sit back there and let your son play the fool. This is our job, and you're nothing but a nuisance." George looked back at Mitchell, his eyes full of disdain but without a word in response. He didn't need to prove anything to men like these. He had overcome too many challenges in his life and knew that the truth would reveal itself. Looking at his son, George felt reassured that, despite the injustice, Thomas would stand up and face it all. Meanwhile, Thomas remained resolute, not letting his anger cloud his judgment. He knew it was just a short distance to the station, where the truth would come to light, and these officers would be held accountable. He said nothing more, but he was filled with determination. As Bradley and Mitchell's taunts continued, he reminded himself that their days of unchecked power would soon end. Finally, the patrol car arrived at the police station. Bradley and Mitchell looked at each other triumphantly, as though they had completed some glorious mission. They had no idea that their arrogance and abuse of power were about to be exposed to the light of justice. Thomas held a calm gaze, knowing that the moment of truth was within reach. And when that moment came, he would be there to see these power-abusing men face the consequences of their actions. Upon arriving at the police station, Bradley and Mitchell quickly pulled Thomas and George out, their faces full of smug satisfaction, as though they had just completed some glorious mission. They roughly opened the car door, shoving father and son onto the ground without any courtesy. Thomas maintained a steely gaze, enduring silently, but George couldn't hide his exhaustion, his steps unsteady. A few officers in the station glanced at the pair. Some chuckled, thinking it was just another routine arrest. "Look, here's our police chief," Bradley mocked, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he pushed Thomas into the station. "Maybe he thinks we'll release him just because he's got a police badge." Mitchell sneered, no less contemptuous. "He probably thinks he's someone important. What a joke." Thomas remained silent, his gaze resolute and unwavering. He knew that the truth would soon come out and that those abusing their power would face consequences. As they were pushed inside, the atmosphere in the station was relaxed, as though nothing unusual was happening. People continued with their work, some casting glances and whispering as they saw Bradley and Mitchell bringing in the two criminals. But then, from down the hallway, Lieutenant Joseph, a seasoned officer with a commanding presence, appeared. He glanced over, then suddenly froze, his eyes widening in shock as he saw Thomas handcuffed and being dragged like a criminal. He couldn't believe his eyes. Joseph had worked with Thomas for a long time and knew him to be a just and honorable leader. "Thomas," Joseph's voice rang out, strong and astonished. You're Chief Thomas Thompson. What on earth are you doing?" Joseph's voice broke the tension, drawing everyone's attention. Everyone stopped what they were doing, the officers turning their heads, eyes now fixed on Thomas and the two officers who stood frozen like statues. The atmosphere in the station shifted instantly from mockery to heavy tension. Bradley and Mitchell's faces turned from arrogant to pale. Joseph strode over, his gaze burning with anger directed at Bradley and Mitchell. "Do you know what you've done? You just arrested and humiliated our police chief." Bradley stammered, his face white as a sheet. I didn't know." We didn't think. Mitchell was no better off, his voice trembling, eyes wide with panic. We were just doing our job. We didn't know he was. Thomas looked directly at the two officers, his voice cold and filled with authority. I told you very clearly who I was, but you refused to listen and chose instead to humiliate me and my father. Joseph looked at the two officers with a gaze as sharp as a knife. Who do you think you are, treating an innocent person like that? That kind of behavior is unacceptable in our force. Silence filled the room. No one dared to speak. Other officers looked at Bradley and Mitchell with discomfort, some showing open disapproval as they realized the blatant abuse of power by their colleagues. Bradley's face was ashen as he struggled to come up with excuses, but nothing he could say would salvage the situation. Thomas kept his steely gaze on them as if looking at those who had betrayed the ideals he had dedicated his life to. You think that with power in your hands, you can do whatever you want without consequences? You've made a serious mistake. Mitchell, now desperate, attempted to beg for forgiveness. I'm sorry, Chief. We didn't know. We didn't think you were. Thomas frowned, his voice sharp and decisive. Didn't think? Is that your excuse for abusing your power to humiliate and assault an innocent elder? You used your duty to assault a defenseless man, and now you want to evade responsibility. Joseph quickly ordered a nearby officer, remove the handcuffs from Chief Thomas and Mr. George immediately. A young officer stepped forward, hands shaking as he unlocked the cuffs from Thomas and George, his face flushed with embarrassment. Thomas rubbed his sore wrists, feeling both the relief of freedom and a deep-seated anger. Thomas stepped toward Bradley and Mitchell, his gaze sharp, filled with resolve and disappointment. In the silence of the police station, his voice rang out powerfully, each word like a blow against the two officers who had ruthlessly abused their authority. You have abused your power and humiliated the people you were sworn to protect, Thomas said, his voice firm but calm, each word underscoring their wrongdoing. You think you can treat others like this simply because you wear a uniform? You haven't just dishonored me and my father. You've tarnished the reputation of the entire police force. Thomas's words left the entire station in silence. All the officers stood frozen, feeling the weight of his rebuke. Bradley and Mitchell, once arrogant and smug, were now pale, their eyes flickering with shame and fear. They dared not meet Thomas's gaze, nor the disdainful eyes of their colleagues. Unable to bear the pressure, Bradley suddenly dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he tried to beg for forgiveness. Please, Chief, forgive us. We didn't mean any harm. We were just trying to do our job. I have a family and children. If I lose this job, I'll lose everything. Mitchell, too, fell to his knees beside him, his voice choked with fear. Please understand, Chief. We didn't know who you were. We were just following protocol. I have young kids at home and I don't want to lose this job. But Thomas looked at them with an unwavering gaze. He knew that showing mercy now would not only be a sign of weakness, but would also betray the values he had always fought to uphold. You're thinking about your families and your children. But did you think about the people you arrest? Did you think about my father when you shoved him to the ground and cuffed him like a criminal simply for sitting quietly on a bench? Did you consider the shame and pain you caused him to me and to the very community you're supposed to protect? Bradley lowered his head, tears streaming down his face as he heard Thomas's cold, piercing accusations. He trembled, struggling to find words of justification, but his attempts were in vain. I didn't think. We were just doing our job. I didn't mean—" Thomas interrupted, his voice as sharp as a blade. "Didn't think? Didn't mean to? Is that how you justify your prejudice and abuse of power? You had every opportunity to stop, to listen when I identified myself, but you chose to mock and exploit your authority. That wasn't a small mistake. It was a conscious choice, driven by arrogance and bias." Mitchell sobbed, his eyes filled with terror. "Please, Thomas, I promise we'll never do this again. Just give us one chance." Thomas looked at the two men before him, now stripped of all pride, left only with despair and fear. "You want a chance? That chance passed long ago, when you chose not to listen, not to respect others. Forgiveness isn't something to be granted easily, especially when you've abused your power to oppress and harm others." The silence in the station grew heavier. Other officers looked on, none daring to intervene. Some hung their heads in shame for their colleagues' actions, while others watched with a look of contempt. The disapproval and disappointment were clear on everyone's faces as they realized that two of their own had tarnished the force's honor. Thomas continued, his voice growing colder. "What you've done doesn't just impact the innocent people you unjustly arrested. It damages the community's trust in law enforcement. Your actions of abuse and discrimination are unforgivable. Justice must be served, and you will face the consequences." Bradley sank even lower, his shoulders shaking with tears. "Please, I don't want to lose everything. I'll do anything to make up for this." Mitchell stammered, his voice broken, devoid of any trace of arrogance. "Please, Chief, we were wrong, but we'll change. We'll never repeat this mistake." But Thomas remained silent, his gaze unwavering against their futile pleas. "You're asking for forgiveness only because you're afraid for yourselves, not because you truly feel remorse. Justice has no room for those who are only sorry when they're caught. You must face the truth that power is not something to be misused." Lieutenant Joseph stepped forward, his voice cold and resolute. "Bradley, Mitchell, you've seriously damaged the honor of this station and the entire force. I'll be forwarding your case to Internal Affairs for investigation, and I'll personally oversee the process. Your careers will never be the same from today onward." A young officer approached, his face serious and embarrassed as he looked at the two men, now reduced to failures. He cuffed Bradley and Mitchell, showing no respect for them. All eyes in the station were now fixed on the pair with disdain and disappointment, and neither officer dared to look up at anyone. In the gaze of everyone present, the arrogance of Bradley and Mitchell had completely dissolved, leaving only profound shame. Thomas watched them being led away, knowing that his actions today sent a clear message to everyone. He felt no regret for withholding easy forgiveness. To him, justice was not something to be compromised, and those who abused power would never be tolerated. Thomas turned to look at his colleagues, his gaze passing over each one. The other officers bowed their heads, some nodding in agreement, understanding that this was a powerful wake-up call for everyone. Today, they have witnessed the consequences of abuse of power and discrimination, and they know that from now on, every action will need to be conducted with respect and fairness. Thomas sighed, feeling as though a weight had been lifted. He turned back to look at his father, who was still standing there with pride and affection in his eyes. George smiled gently, a smile both firm and full of love. Thomas understood that the fight for justice was far from over, and today was just one small battle in a much larger journey. But he was determined to continue, not only for himself, but for those he loved, for the community, and for the ideals he had always pursued. Lieutenant Joseph, who had worked in the force for over 20 years and had seen many of the system's dark sides, stepped forward. He was a man with a sharp gaze and a serious demeanor, highly respected for his honesty and sense of duty. When he looked at Thomas, his eyes were filled with admiration and solidarity. Joseph understood better than anyone that this wasn't just a single investigation, but a declaration of war against the abuse of power and injustice that had long plagued the police system. "Thomas," Joseph said, his voice strong and determined, "I will personally oversee this investigation and ensure that justice is served. We cannot allow actions like these to continue tarnishing the reputation of our force. You have my full support, as well as the support of everyone who wants to see real change." Thomas nodded, feeling reassured by Joseph's commitment. He knew that with people like Joseph by his side, he would have the strength to continue this challenging reform journey. For Thomas, this was not a short-term task, but a long-term mission requiring persistence and resolve. Today, he was fighting not only for himself and his father, but for everyone who had been hurt and humiliated by those who abused the badge. The other officers in the station watched in silence. Some lowered their heads, embarrassed by what had just happened, while others stood still, their gazes thoughtful as they gradually understood the significance of the event. This wasn't just a routine disciplinary decision. It was a clear declaration that the days of tolerating abuse of power were over. Everyone could feel that this was the beginning of a profound change, a cleansing the force had long awaited. Thomas turned to face the officers, his gaze sharp but also sincere. He knew that, to fulfill this mission, he needed the support of the entire team. His voice echoed, deep and commanding. "Today, we witness something disgraceful, but it's also an opportunity to reflect on ourselves. Our mission is to protect the community and uphold justice, not to abuse our power against those we are meant to serve. It's time to clean up our ranks, and I hope you'll join me on this journey." Thomas's words were like a fresh breeze, carrying hope but also a sense of gravity. He didn't expect immediate change, but he knew that with determination and consistency, they could restore the police force to ideals of justice and integrity. A young officer, who had only recently joined the force, stepped forward with a serious expression and said, "Chief, I stand with you. I believe we need a clean, trustworthy force, and I'm ready to do my part to contribute to this change." Other officers began to nod, one by one. A veteran officer who had witnessed many bad habits within the force but had never had the chance to speak up stepped forward, his voice filled with emotion. "I've been waiting for this for a long time, and today I see that we have real hope. You're the first in many years to stand up and confront these issues without fear, and I believe that under your leadership, we can make a difference." Thomas looked around, seeing the support and resolve in his colleagues' eyes, and felt a rising sense of hope. This was not just his fight, but a fight for everyone who wanted to preserve justice and honor in the force. He knew they could begin to build a police force the community could trust. As Joseph followed Bradley and Mitchell down the hall toward internal affairs, the atmosphere in the station became eerily quiet. Everyone watched as the two, once so arrogant, were now nothing more than two humiliated shadows. Bradley and Mitchell's steps were heavy, their faces drained of color, and their eyes full of dread as they realized that everything had changed. No one laughed or jeered, and no one would hide such wrongdoings anymore. The time when misconduct could be brushed under the rug had ended. Joseph turned back, his gaze stern and unyielding. "I will personally supervise this investigation, and I will ensure that no one is above the law. From today on, every action of the force will be under scrutiny, and there will be no room for those who abuse power or discriminate." Thomas nodded, feeling reassured knowing that people like Joseph were supporting him in this journey. He knew he had initiated a reform, and this battle would be difficult, but he also understood that with the determination and unity of his colleagues, they could return the force to its rightful values. As the officers returned to their work, the atmosphere in the station had completely transformed. No longer was there apathy or mockery, but rather a silence filled with self-reflection and solidarity. Some exchanged glances, silently reminding each other that from now on, every action would carry a higher responsibility. Others lowered their heads, contemplating their past mistakes and resolving not to let something like this happen again. Thomas turned to look at his father, who had watched the entire confrontation with pride and emotion in his eyes. George stepped forward, placing a warm, trusting hand on his son's shoulder. "You did the right thing, Thomas. This is a big step, not just for you, but for the whole community. I'm proud of you." Thomas smiled, filled with pride, but also a deep awareness of his new responsibility. "Dad, I'll keep fighting for justice, not just because of what happened today, but for everyone who doesn't have someone to stand up for them. I will make this force one that the people can trust." George nodded, his eyes glistening with belief and admiration. "You are the hope of this community, Thomas. You've started something that no one else dared to do. Keep walking this path." Standing beside his father in a rare moment of peace, Thomas felt a sense of relief and optimism for the future. He knew that this journey would be full of challenges, but with the unity of people like Joseph, his colleagues, and the community, he believed they could bring the police force back to its foundational values: justice, transparency, and integrity. From that day on, Thomas knew the responsibility on his shoulders went beyond the role of police chief. He was a guardian of justice and a beacon of hope for the community. Under his leadership, the station entered a new era, one where justice was the foundation, and power meant only to serve and protect. Thomas and his father walked to the park, the place where this horrifying event had begun. The late afternoon was peaceful, with the last rays of sunlight filtering through the leaves, illuminating the familiar paths where George often strolled. He looked around, feeling a mix of relief and an indescribable sadness. He had never imagined that at his age he would have to face such cruelty and injustice from those who were supposed to protect him. As they approached the old wooden bench where George usually sat each afternoon, he stopped and looked at Thomas with eyes full of emotion and pride. "You did the right thing, Thomas. I've never been prouder of you than I am today," he said, his voice slightly trembling but resolute. "I've faced a lot of injustice in my life, starting from when I was young. I thought things would be different now, but even at this age I am still treated as if I have no worth." George paused, taking a moment to gather himself before continuing. "But you showed that justice is not something we should ever give up on, even when faced with cruelty. You stood up, confronted, and fought back. Not everyone dares to do that, and I'm proud that you have the strength to do it." Thomas listened in silence, a mix of pride and regret swelling within him. Though he was the police chief, entrusted with the duty of upholding justice, he felt that he had failed to protect the person who mattered most to him, the father who had raised him and instilled in him the values he held dear. "Dad, I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from the beginning. I should have been there sooner. I should have stopped this before it got so bad. I vowed to defend justice, but I couldn't even protect you." Gently, George placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze tender and forgiving. "Thomas, you don't need to apologize. You did what needed to be done. What matters isn't what happened, but how you faced it. You didn't turn away from the truth, and you didn't back down from injustice. Life will always bring unexpected challenges, but it's how you confront them that defines who you are. You stood up for what's right, and that makes me prouder than anything else." Thomas nodded, feeling encouraged by his father, though a weight still lingered in his heart as he reflected on his role and responsibilities. "Dad, today taught me a valuable lesson. I realized that justice isn't just a principle in a book or a slogan we repeat. True justice is about protecting those who need protection, even when it means standing up to those who hold power. Sometimes, to defend justice, we must face isolation and be willing to endure pressure and criticism, but it's worth it for the sake of truth and what's right." George nodded, pride shining in his eyes. "You've understood this from the depths of your heart. I believe that with your determination and courage, you will bring about real change. You're someone the community can trust, and that trust comes not from a title or position, but from the bravery and responsibility you've shown." The two continued to walk along the quiet paths of the park, needing no more words, but both feeling a deep sense of connection. For George, Thomas was not just his son, but a symbol of hope and faith in justice. George had lived through years of hardships and trials, but had never lost faith in fairness, and he now saw that faith reflected in Thomas's actions. When they neared an old, towering tree where George would often stop to take in the scenery, he turned to Thomas, his voice warm but full of resolve. "You know, Thomas, life is an unending series of challenges, but how we face them is what gives us real value. I've seen you overcome this trial with grace, and I believe you will face even greater challenges in the future." Thomas smiled, sitting down on the bench beside the old tree, patting the seat to invite his father to join him. "Dad, I promise I'll never forget today's lesson. I'll keep fighting for the values you taught me: honesty, responsibility, and perseverance. I will protect justice, not only for myself, but for those who don't have anyone to stand up for them." George sat beside Thomas, feeling a surge of pride and relief. After years of witnessing social change and facing injustice himself, he saw that his son was not only a police chief, but a true leader, a man willing to confront challenges and never abandon his ideals. In the fading light of the evening, father and son sat in silence, watching the last rays of sunlight dance through the leaves. George sighed, not from fatigue but from a sense of peace, knowing his son had truly matured and understood his responsibilities. "Thomas," George said softly, his voice filled with affection, "you are my greatest pride. You're not only a good son, but someone the community can rely on. What you did today was not just about protecting me. It was about upholding the faith of everyone who depends on you. You are the embodiment of the justice they need." Thomas looked at his father, his eyes filled with deep emotion. He knew that the road ahead was long and full of challenges, but he was ready. With his father's support, confidence in himself, and determination to uphold justice, Thomas believed he could overcome anything. As the last light faded behind the trees, Thomas and George stood up, ready to go home. They walked together in the soft glow of the sunset, their hearts filled with faith and hope. They knew that from now on their lives would never be the same. But today's events had strengthened their bond and set a new mission for Thomas, to bring justice wherever he went and to uphold the community's trust in the force he led. In those quiet steps, George felt at peace, knowing that Thomas had truly grasped the meaning of justice and responsibility. For Thomas, this was not just a life lesson, but the beginning of a journey to uphold what was right, a journey he would resolutely pursue to the end. The internal affairs investigation that followed was conducted rigorously and transparently, lasting several weeks to ensure every aspect of the incident was thoroughly examined. Led by experienced investigators, the investigation began by gathering all direct evidence from the scene. The investigative team carefully analyzed each segment of video footage that captured George being mistreated and the arrogant behavior of the two officers, Bradley and Mitchell. In addition to the video evidence, investigators interviewed witnesses who were present in the park that day, including residents and nearby workers. Witnesses recounted the shocking sight of two officers using unnecessary violence against an innocent elderly man. One witness said they couldn't believe their eyes when Chief Thomas arrived, introduced himself, and was still ignored, mocked, and even handcuffed roughly by the officers. The investigation also extended beyond the events of that day to include a review of Bradley and Mitchell's service records to assess their past behavior. Through their files, the investigative team discovered that the two officers had previously been reported for abuses of power, though these complaints were often dismissed or resolved internally without specific disciplinary action. This information complicated and intensified the investigation, revealing a larger issue with how misconduct was monitored and addressed within the police force. Furthermore, the investigation delved into the station's internal oversight system. Investigators found a lack of transparency and effectiveness in the way officers' misconduct was reported and handled. Some officers admitted they were hesitant to speak up about the wrongdoings of their colleagues, fearing retaliation or doubting that their complaints would be taken seriously. This had fostered a work environment where misconduct could be easily concealed and repeated. Lieutenant Joseph, who led the Internal Affairs Department and had committed to Thomas's vision of reforming the force, personally oversaw the entire investigation. He conducted internal interviews, inviting several veteran officers to share issues they had observed but had previously lacked the opportunity to address. These officers recounted witnessing various instances of misconduct by Bradley and Mitchell, but felt too concerned for their jobs to oppose them. Some admitted feeling pressured when faced with the prospect of standing against abusers within the ranks. A crucial part of the investigation was Thomas's testimony. In his statement, Thomas not only detailed the events that took place in the park, but also emphasized the moral responsibility that each police officer must uphold. He stressed that Bradley and Mitchell's actions were not just an abuse of power, but a flagrant disregard for the basic principles of justice. Thomas made it clear that he could not allow such behavior to persist in the force he led. The final report of the investigation was submitted to the court and partially released to the public to affirm the police station's commitment to transparency and accountability. The report detailed undeniable evidence of Bradley and Mitchell's abuse of power and recommended a comprehensive overhaul of the police force's internal monitoring systems. Internal Affairs concluded that in addition to severely disciplining the individuals involved, regular audits should be established with the involvement of independent organizations to ensure transparency. Though the investigation concluded, its findings sparked a broader discussion in society about professional ethics and the responsibilities of the police force. Finally, the trial commenced with the intense interest and attention of the public. From early morning, the courtroom was packed. Journalists from both major and minor media outlets crowded at the entrance, cameras ready to capture every significant moment. People from all around gathered, those who had followed Thomas and George's story from the beginning, eagerly awaiting justice to be served. On online forums and social media, the trial became a hot topic, with thousands of comments and shares. Once everyone was seated, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense and solemn. Nobody spoke or showed signs of impatience. All eyes were fixed on the defendant's stand, where Officers Bradley and Mitchell faced justice. Both men looked down, their faces weary and tense as they faced serious accusations of abuse of power and discrimination. They understood that they were facing not only the law, but also the scrutiny of the entire community, which had been hurt and outraged by their actions. One by one, witnesses were called to testify. First were the parkgoers present that day, those who had seen firsthand the mistreatment of George, an innocent elderly man, due to baseless suspicion and the officer's prejudice. Their emotional and outraged testimonies further illuminated the nature of the case, leaving the courtroom with a sense of indignation. A middle-aged woman, her eyes brimming with tears, shared that she never thought she would witness an elderly man being treated so cruelly in broad daylight in a public space. Each account served as a blow, exposing the inhumanity and disregard for justice shown by Bradley and Mitchell. Next, video and images of the incident were displayed on a large screen in the courtroom. The footage was so clear that no one could deny the severity of the officer's misconduct. The screen replayed the scene of George being shoved to the ground, and Thomas being handcuffed and mocked as he tried to protect his father, leaving everyone in the room shocked and angered. Some members of the public couldn't suppress their sighs and whispered expressions of anger as they saw the extent of the officer's abuse of power. These pieces of evidence were like sharp cuts, laying bare the cruelty and injustice that Bradley and Mitchell had inflicted, leaving no room for doubt. When it was Thomas's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. Everyone listening closely as he recounted each moment of the incident. His calm voice conveyed his resolve as he not only described what had happened but also emphasized the responsibility of every police officer to uphold justice and treat all citizens fairly, regardless of status or appearance. Our police force is not a tool to impose power on innocent people, Thomas said, his eyes firm. Today's trial is not only about justice for my father, but also about protecting the honor of all dedicated officers who serve their communities. Thomas's words inspired admiration and emotion in the room. He was not standing there only to defend his family, but also to defend the honor of the profession and the ethical values he believed in. His words were a call to responsibility and loyalty to justice, making the other officers in the room reflect deeply on their duties. After days of intense hearings and deliberations, the court reached its verdict. Officers Bradley and Mitchell were found guilty of abuse of power and gross professional misconduct. Both were sentenced to prison, stripped of their right to serve, and required to publicly apologize to George, Thomas, and the community they had wronged. The verdict was not only a victory for Thomas and his family, but a significant win for the community. It was a clear message that abuse of power and discrimination would never be tolerated, and that the justice system still had people who staunchly defended it. The trial ended with applause and overwhelming support from the community. People felt that justice had been served and expressed gratitude to Thomas and George for courageously standing up, exposing wrongdoing, and encouraging necessary change in the system. An elderly man from the audience came forward to shake Thomas's hand, saying, "Thank you for not giving up." Messages of support and gratitude continued to pour in from people everywhere, seeing this as a powerful example that justice can prevail when enough people stand up for it. The verdict was not just a punishment for Bradley and Mitchell, but also a stark reminder for all officers within the police force. They understood that from now on, abuse of power would not be overlooked and that responsibility to justice and the community must always come first. The story of Thomas and George became a symbol of courage and resilience, reminding everyone that justice is not something distant. It is something each of us can achieve as long as we continue fighting for it. When the trial of Thomas and George was broadcast, no one anticipated it would quickly become the focal point of media attention nationwide. The video showing George, a gentle elderly man, being treated harshly, along with images of Thomas, the steadfast police chief standing up for his father and confronting those abusing power, shocked the entire community. Major newspapers, TV channels, and social media platforms continuously updated the public on the case. The story of a courageous son and his elderly father spread rapidly, sparking a wave of support and outrage among the public. Countless people shared their deep sympathy for George and gratitude toward Thomas for standing up for justice, not only for his father but for everyone who had endured injustice. Online forums were filled with messages of encouragement, personal stories of similar experiences, and calls for reform. People didn't just share the story, but spread a powerful message. Justice needs to be protected and upheld, not only by those in uniform, but by the entire community. The support movement went beyond words on social media and quickly turned into real action. Social organizations, human rights groups, and local communities organized meetings, workshops, and discussions on reforming the police system. Thomas's story became a focal point for discussions on fairness, ethics, and the responsibilities of law enforcement. From small neighborhoods to government buildings, the story was retold as a reminder that no one is above the law, and that those with power must be accountable for their actions. At the police station where Thomas worked, the atmosphere also changed completely. Colleagues who had previously remained silent in the face of injustice now reconsidered their roles and responsibilities. Some who had been indifferent began to realize that such attitudes not only harmed victims like George, but also endangered the entire police force's relationship with the community. They understood that to restore trust, they needed to act and start with self-change. Lieutenant Joseph, who had stood by Thomas throughout the process, could not hide his pride and solidarity. He knew that this story wasn't just a short-term event, but a catalyst for a shift in the mindset and behavior of the entire force. Joseph organized meetings with station officers, emphasizing the importance of upholding justice and encouraging everyone to take Thomas and George's story as a continual reminder. He asserted that only when all members of the force understand and adhere to ethical values can the community rely on them. Meanwhile, Thomas continued to receive support and encouragement from all directions. Letters, emails, and messages poured into the station, with people thanking him for standing up for what's right, for justice, and the community. They saw Thomas as a symbol of hope, a man willing to confront abuse and uphold society's core values. Not only from within the country, but messages from international organizations and human rights advocates also poured in, praising Thomas's courage and sense of duty. Feeling the overwhelming support from the community, Thomas knew that this was the time to implement real change. He began organizing meetings with colleagues and community members, listening to public concerns and proposing concrete reforms. These meetings became opportunities for police and the public to communicate, rebuild trust, and restore faith in the police force. Thomas proposed specific reforms to strengthen internal oversight, establish transparent complaint handling mechanisms, and create training programs on professional ethics for officers. He understood that change had to begin at the roots, from the mindset of each person in the force. Therefore, he focused on training, encouraging officers to reflect on their roles not just as law enforcers, but as guardians of justice and community trust. The event's impact extended beyond the local community, catching the attention of higher authorities. City leaders could not ignore the strong public reaction and the pressure from the community. They committed to a comprehensive reform of the police system, creating stricter monitoring mechanisms and policies to prevent abuses of power. Local officials also proposed establishing an independent oversight committee to monitor and address police misconduct, ensuring that justice is always maintained. At a press conference afterward, Thomas had the opportunity to speak to the entire community and the media. He spoke about the lessons learned from the incident, emphasizing the importance of honesty, responsibility, and ethics in law enforcement. We are not just law enforcers, we are protectors of the community's trust, Thomas affirmed. Justice isn't just the duty of one individual, but the responsibility of all of us. When we uphold ethical values and treat everyone fairly, we truly become people the community can trust. Thomas's speech spread quickly, resonating with millions of people. It wasn't merely a promise from a police chief, but a pledge from a son, a citizen, and a friend of the community. The reforms he proposed not only improved his station, but spread to other areas, becoming a model for those wanting to build a transparent and trustworthy police force. The story of George and Thomas became more than just a personal account of an injustice, turned into a symbol of change and the power of courage. This story awakened many, reminding them that standing up for justice isn't only for oneself, but for everyone around them. Thomas's reforms became a clear testament that, even as a single individual, one can make a difference with enough determination and persistence. Watching the reforms and the wave of change his son was bringing about, George couldn't hide his pride. He knew that the values he had passed on to Thomas, honesty, patience, and resolve, had truly taken root, shaping Thomas into a man who stood up for what was right and became a symbol of justice. For Thomas, this story was not just an isolated event, but a driving force to continue his reforms, to defend justice relentlessly, and to protect the trust that people had placed in him. On the way home, George and Thomas walked together, feeling a unique connection and deep pride. In their hearts, this story had become a mission, a promise that they would continue to uphold noble values, continue to fight for justice, and always stand up for what's right. Their story proved that when we stand on the side of justice and truth, we are never alone, because the entire community is beside us, supporting and believing. Thomas dared to confront abuse of power, not only to protect his father, but also to uphold the core values of justice. His and George's story reminds us that no one is above the law, and that justice will always prevail when people are willing to fight for it. If you were Thomas in this situation, would you have the courage to stand up for justice in the face of challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and share this video to spread the message of justice, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on meaningful stories. See you next time.
The sharp, rapid pounding on the front door jolted Thomas Raines from his breakfast. He set down his coffee, his instincts immediately on high alert. Years in the Marines had trained him to recognize trouble before it announced itself. He walked to the door, glancing through the peephole. Two uniformed officers stood on his porch, flanked by a third man in a suit, Ronald Sutherland, the smug, rotund president of the Oakwood Heights HOA. Thomas exhaled slowly, already knowing this wasn't a social visit. He unlatched the door and pulled it open. "Can I help you?" One of the officers, a stocky man with a mustache, squared his shoulders. "Mr. Raines, we're here to serve an eviction order. As of this morning, your property is no longer under your ownership." Thomas's fingers curled into his palm. "Excuse me." Sutherland stepped forward with a faux, apologetic smile. "It's all very unfortunate, really," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But you've been delinquent on your HOA fees for quite some time now. We sent multiple notices, and when you failed to respond, the board had no choice but to initiate foreclosure proceedings." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "That's a lie. I've paid every dime on time, and you know it." The second officer, a younger man, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The mustached cop, however, held up a thick folder. "We have paperwork, Mr. Raines." "This is legal." "Legal?" Thomas let out a short, humorless laugh. "This is theft." Sutherland sighed dramatically, flipping through some pages. "Look, I understand you're upset, but the rules are the rules, and we have bylaws in place to ensure the community remains well, up to standard." There it was, the real reason. Thomas had seen it coming for years. Oakwood Heights had changed. It had gone from a quiet neighborhood to a pristine, overpriced enclave where the HOA ruled like a pack of petty tyrants. They didn't like that Thomas still had his workshop out back. They didn't like that he fixed up motorcycles in his garage. They didn't like him, a veteran who didn't fit their manicured, picture-perfect image of suburban life. And now, they were trying to erase him altogether. Thomas kept his composure. "So let me get this straight," he said, folding his arms. "You're evicting a Marine, a homeowner, over fees I never actually owed, and you've got the cops playing enforcers for the HOA now." The younger officer swallowed hard. The mustached one didn't flinch. Sutherland, though, grinned. "That's correct." Thomas nodded slowly, as if considering. Then he stepped back into his house and slammed the door in their faces. The pounding on the door resumed almost instantly, heavier this time. Mr. Raines opened the door. The mustached officer barked. "We're not leaving until you comply." Thomas took his time. He strolled to the kitchen, retrieved his phone, and calmly started recording. If they wanted a fight, he'd make sure the whole world saw exactly what they were doing. He reopened the door, now holding his phone up. The camera was locked on Sutherland and the officers. "Say that again," Thomas said, his voice steady. Sutherland's smug grin faltered. "There's no need for theatrics, Mr. Raines." "Oh, I think there is," Thomas shot back. "You're trying to steal my home under false pretenses, and you brought law enforcement with you to intimidate me. So, go ahead, say it again, on camera." The mustached officer, clearly irritated, stepped forward, put the phone away. "Not a chance." The younger officer shifted uneasily. "Sir, we're just following procedure. If there is a dispute, you can take it up with the courts. That's exactly what I'm going to do." Thomas turned his attention back to Sutherland. "Where's the proof I owe anything?" Sutherland pulled out a document from his folder and waved it like a trophy. "Right here. Official notice of foreclosure due to unpaid fees." Thomas smirked. "Unpaid fees, huh? Funny, because I keep all my records. I have proof that every payment was made, on time, every time." He paused, tilting his head slightly. "I'm guessing your paperwork conveniently doesn't match up with mine, does it?" Sutherland's confidence wavered for just a second, but he quickly regained his smirk. "If there was a clerical error, you should have disputed it before the foreclosure." "There was no error," Thomas countered. "This was planned." Sutherland scoffed. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Thomas leaned in slightly. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks a whole lot like fraud. You do know that illegal foreclosures carry serious legal consequences, don't you?" The younger officer glanced at Sutherland. "Sir, maybe we should." But the mustached cop cut him off. "Enough. Mr. Raines, you have 24 hours to vacate the premises." Thomas chuckled. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere." He tapped his phone screen. "And neither is this video. I think a few lawyers might find it very interesting." Sutherland's expression darkened. He had expected Thomas to roll over, to panic, to pack his things and leave without a fight. But Thomas wasn't going anywhere, and now the real battle had begun. Sutherland's smile was gone now. He glanced at the mustached officer, a silent signal passing between them. The cop adjusted his belt and took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Sir, let's not escalate this further. You don't want to get arrested for obstruction." Thomas grinned. "Obstruction of what? Defending my own home from an illegal seizure. That's cute." The younger officer looked more uncomfortable by the second. "Sir, maybe we should verify some of this before." Sutherland shot him a sharp look, cutting him off. "The paperwork is legitimate. The HOA follows legal procedures." Thomas laughed under his breath. "Oh yeah, then let's do this the right way. I'll call my lawyer and we'll settle this in court." Sutherland smirked again. "That's your right, of course. But unfortunately, the auction is scheduled for tomorrow morning. By the time your lawyer does anything, your house will already belong to someone else." That hit Thomas like a gut punch. They weren't just trying to scare him, they were trying to track the sale before he could fight back. For the first time, he saw the full picture. This wasn't about HOA fees. This was a coordinated effort. They had targeted him, manipulated records, and weaponized legal loopholes to steal his home right out from under him. And worse, the cops were in on it. Thomas had dealt with corrupt leaders before, men who thought their power made them untouchable. He knew their kind, and he knew exactly how to break them. He took a slow step back. "All right," he said, nodding. "I see how it is. But before I go anywhere, I just have one question for you, Sutherland." The HOA president smirked, thinking he had won. "Go ahead." Thomas tilted his head. "How much are they paying you?" That wiped the smirk clean off his face. Thomas let the question linger, watching the reaction unfold. The younger officer's eyes darted to Sutherland, suddenly alert. The mustached cop's jaw tensed. But Sutherland, he hesitated. It was brief, but it was there. A flicker of uncertainty. Thomas pounced. "You know what I think," he continued, stepping forward. "I think you're not just enforcing the HOA rules. I think you and a few of your buddies are running a little side hustle, targeting homeowners, faking violations, and pushing them out so you can flip their houses for a profit." Silence. The younger officer's mouth parted slightly, as if he were just now realizing he might be on the wrong side of something very illegal. Thomas turned to him. "You still sure you want to back this up, kid? Because I guarantee, when this goes public, you're not gonna like where your name ends up." The young cop swallowed hard. Enough," Sutherland snapped. He turned to the mustached officer. "Get him out of here." The cop nodded and reached for his handcuffs, and that's when Thomas made his move. Thomas wasn't about to go quietly. As the mustached officer reached for his cuffs, Thomas took a single step back, not in fear but in calculation. His training kicked in, assessing the space, the exits, and most importantly, the weaknesses of the men in front of him. "Think real hard about what you're doing," Thomas said, his voice low and steady, "because the moment you put your hands on me, this turns into something a whole lot bigger than an eviction." The younger officer hesitated. His gaze flickered between Thomas and the mustached cop. "Wait," he said. "Maybe we should." "No maybes," the mustached cop growled. "He's resisting." Thomas smirked. "Resisting? All I did was ask a question." He held up his phone, still recording. "And now the whole world's gonna hear how quickly you wanted to jump straight to force. Almost like you've done this before." Sutherland's face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but I do," Thomas shot back. "I did my homework on you, Sutherland. You and your little HOA buddies have a pattern. This ain't the first time you've pulled this stunt, is it?" The younger officer looked at Sutherland sharply. "What's he talking about?" Sutherland scoffed. "He's just trying to stall. It doesn't matter what he says. He has no proof." Thomas grinned. "That's where you're wrong." Sutherland's smirk faltered. "See, I don't just keep records of my payments," Thomas continued. "I keep records of everything, every notice, every fine, every violation you've ever hit me with, and guess what? So do the other homeowners you tried to screw over." Sutherland's jaw clenched. Thomas took another step forward, his presence towering over the smaller man. "You got greedy. Thought you could run a real estate scam under the guise of HOA enforcement, pushing people out, flipping their homes, pocketing the profits. You've done it before, haven't you?" The younger officer stiffened. "Sir, is that true?" Sutherland turned to him, forcing a fake chuckle. "Of course not. This is ridiculous." Thomas shook his head. "No, what's ridiculous is that you got careless. You left a paper trail, and lucky for me, I know a few investigative journalists who love this kind of story. One of them's already looking into you as we speak." Sutherland went pale. The mustached officer's confidence faltered for the first time. "This is a legal eviction," he muttered, but it sounded weak. Thomas turned the phone slightly toward him. "Still sure about that, officer? You want to be the guy who gets caught on camera helping a criminal organization steal homes from veterans, because I guarantee the second this footage goes public, you'll be out of a job." Silence. The younger officer took a deep breath. We should probably verify everything before. Sutherland spun on him. "Shut up." That was the final crack in the dam. The young cop stepped away from Sutherland, no longer convinced of his innocence. The mustached officer hesitated, suddenly unsure, and Thomas, he saw it all unraveling. Now it was just a matter of time. Sutherland was sweating now. The smug confidence he had walked in with was cracking like cheap plaster. His eyes darted between Thomas, the younger officer, and his mustached enforcer. He knew he was losing control. Thomas leaned in slightly, his voice as sharp as a blade. "So what's it gonna be, Sutherland? You gonna double down, or are you gonna come clean before this blows up in your face?" The mustached officer was still trying to salvage what little authority he had left. "Enough of this," he barked. "Turn off that phone, Rains." Thomas didn't even blink. Not a chance. "In fact, why don't you go ahead and state your name for the recording? Let everyone know exactly who you are before this goes to court." The officer's hand twitched near his belt, but the younger cop stepped between them. "Hold." "On," he said, his voice firmer now. "If what Mr. Rains is saying is true, we can't be involved in this. We need to verify the claims before we enforce anything." Sutherland rounded on him, his voice laced with panic. "You're a police officer, not a lawyer. The HOA followed legal procedures, and we have authority here." Thomas chuckled. "Authority over what? The evidence stacking up against you." He turned his phone slightly so the camera was back on Sutherland. "Let's talk about that paper trail, shall we? You altered records, filed false violations, and forged foreclosure documents to push people out of their homes. That's felony fraud." Sutherland's lip curled. "You have nothing, don't I?" Thomas pulled out his own folder from the counter, one he had been preparing ever since the HOA started its harassment campaign. He flipped it open, revealing every payment receipt, HOA letter, and a detailed list of previous homeowners who had mysteriously defaulted on payments right before their homes went to auction. "I did some digging," Thomas said, flipping the pages. "Turns out the last 5 houses that went into foreclosure had one thing in common, and guess what? I contacted the previous owners. Every single one of them said they paid their fees, just like I did. But somehow their payments never processed either." The younger officer stiffened. "Sir, if that's true, this isn't an HOA matter. This is a criminal case." The mustached cop looked like someone had just slapped him. His authority was slipping fast. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Thomas shot back. "Because if you arrest me, you'll be complicit. This video will go straight to the press, and when they start digging, they'll find out exactly how many homeowners got scammed by this racket. You really want to go down with him." Silence. The mustached officer's jaw clenched. Then, to everyone's surprise, he took a slow step back. Sutherland's eyes widened in panic. "What are you doing? Arrest him." The mustached cop exhaled sharply but didn't move. The younger officer reached for his radio. "We need to call this in. This might be bigger than we thought." Sutherland's face twisted into desperation. "You idiots. Do you have any idea what you're doing? You can't investigate me." Thomas grinned. "Oh, I think they can, and they will." Sutherland turned back to Thomas, his rage barely contained. "You have no idea who you're messing with." But Thomas wasn't intimidated. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Neither do you." Sutherland's arrogance had carried him this far, but now it was crumbling around him. The mustached officer was hesitating. The younger cop was already on the radio, and Thomas, he was just getting started. "You think this is over?" Sutherland hissed, voice low and shaking with rage. "I have connections. You don't just—" "Connections?" Thomas interrupted with a smirk. "That's funny. You think your bud is gonna save you when the state gets involved? Because that's exactly where this is going." The younger officer finished speaking into his radio and looked up. "Dispatch is sending a supervisor. They want us to stand by." Sutherland snapped his head toward him. "You idiot. We don't need a supervisor. We need to get him out of the house." "Funny," Thomas said, crossing his arms. "You keep saying my house like it's still up for debate. You really that desperate to get rid of me, Sutherland?" Sutherland's face turned red, but he had no good answer. The younger officer took a slow step back toward his partner, lowering his voice just enough for Thomas to hear. "Look, I don't like this. If he's right, we're about to be accessories to a crime." The mustached cop's jaw was tight. He still wanted to exert control, to force the situation to go his way. But the weight of the accusations, the live recording, and now the presence of incoming oversight, it was too much. He wasn't about to go down for Sutherland's scheme. The man exhaled. Sharply, then, slowly, he turned toward the HOA president. "Sutherland," he said, "I think we need to wait for the supervisor." Sutherland's face twisted. "You're really gonna do this? You're gonna side with him over me? You lied to us," the younger officer said firmly. "If what he's saying checks out, you're committing fraud. We can't enforce an eviction if it was based on illegal actions." Sutherland looked like a man on the verge of exploding. His plan had been perfect, until Thomas had fought back. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "No," Thomas said, stepping forward. "You did. You got greedy, you got sloppy, and now you're caught. And guess what? That fancy little scam you and your HOA goons have been running, it's over." Sutherland took a shaking breath. His hands curled into fists. "This isn't over," he muttered. At that moment, a black unmarked SUV pulled up outside. Thomas spotted two men in suits stepping out, probably investigators, likely state, level. They walked with purpose, their eyes scanning the scene. Thomas grinned. "Oh, I'd say it's over," he said, watching as Sutherland's face drained of color, because now the real authorities had arrived. Sutherland stood frozen as the two investigators approached. The younger officer stepped forward to meet them, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Supervisor's just sent you," he asked. One of the men, a tall figure in a crisp navy suit, flashed a badge. "State Attorney's Office. We've been monitoring complaints about illegal foreclosures in this district. Got an urgent call about a developing situation." Sutherland's face twitched, but he tried to keep his composure. "This is all a misunderstanding," he began, smoothing down his tie. "A procedural issue, nothing more." The second investigator, an older man with piercing gray eyes, cut him off. "We'll determine that. Right now, we have evidence that multiple properties in this neighborhood may have been fraudulently seized and sold under false pretenses. And your name, Mr. Sutherland, keeps coming up." The color drained from Sutherland's face. I had nothing to do with that." The younger officer, still holding his radio, took a step back. He was no longer standing with the HOA president. He was standing with the law. "We might have been called here under false pretenses," he admitted. "The homeowner has proof that payments were made, but the records were tampered with." The investigator nodded. "Then this is now a criminal matter." He turned to the mustached officer. "Did you attempt to forcibly remove Mr. Raines from his property without verifying the legitimacy of the foreclosure?" The mustached cop stiffened, sweat forming on his brow. He didn't answer. The second investigator took a step forward. "Failure to perform due diligence in an eviction involving fraud can make you complicit. We'll be reviewing your actions today." Thomas folded his arms, watching the shift unfold. Sutherland, once so cocky and assured, was now shrinking under the weight of real consequences. "This is ridiculous," Sutherland snapped. "I have legal authority here. The HOA bylaws are binding. We followed the process. And that's exactly what we're investigating." The gray-eyed investigator interrupted. "Because if those processes were manipulated, if foreclosures were intentionally fabricated to force homeowners out, then you're not just violating civil laws, you're committing organized fraud." Sutherland's mouth opened, but no words came out. "Tell me, Mr. Sutherland," the investigator continued, "where does the money from these auctions go?" Silence. Thomas saw it in Sutherland's eyes, the realization that he was caught, that his shield of paperwork and bureaucracy wouldn't protect him anymore. The second investigator turned to Thomas. "Mr. Raines, do you have all of your documentation?" Thomas nodded and handed over his folder. "Every fraudulent fine, every payment, every letter, and I have contacts for other homeowners who got pushed out the same way." The investigator flipped through the files, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at Sutherland. "Mr. Sutherland, you are now under investigation for fraudulent foreclosure practices, falsifying financial records, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud." Sutherland stumbled back. "Wait, you can't just turn around," the first investigator said coldly. "You're coming with us." And just like that, the cuffs clicked around Sutherland's wrists. For the first time since stepping onto Thomas's porch, the HOA president had nothing to say. As the metal cuffs locked around Sutherland's wrists, the smug arrogance that had carried him this far finally shattered. His mouth opened in protest, but no words came out. The younger officer stepped away, distancing himself from the man he had almost followed blindly. The mustached cop stood rigid, knowing his own role in this was being scrutinized. Thomas leaned against his doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. "You have no idea what you've done," Sutherland finally hissed, his voice dripping with desperation. "I have lawyers. I have connections. You think this is over." The gray-eyed investigator didn't even flinch. "Yes, actually, I do." He turned to the mustached officer. "And you, if we find out you were knowingly assisting in illegal evictions, I suggest you start cooperating now before you end up in a cell next to him." The officer hesitated, then stiffly nodded. I'll assist with the investigation." Thomas smirked. Smart choice. Sutherland twisted in the investigator's grip. "You're making a mistake. The HOA has the right to enforce its policies. We were keeping this neighborhood clean." The older investigator raised a brow. "By committing felony fraud, by robbing veterans of their homes." Sutherland clenched his teeth, but said nothing. He knew he had lost. The investigators led him toward the black SUV, his protests growing weaker with every step. The younger officer exchanged a glance with Thomas before finally shaking his head. I didn't know." Thomas gave him a long look before nodding, then learned from it. The cop swallowed hard and turned away, stepping back toward his cruiser. With Sutherland stuffed into the vehicle, the investigator returned to Thomas. "This isn't over yet. We're going to dig into all the HOA records. If there's a full-scale fraud operation, we'll make sure everyone involved faces justice." Thomas nodded, "Good, and let the other homeowners know. They deserve to get their homes back." The investigator extended his hand. "Appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Rains. You didn't just save your home today. You may have taken down an entire ring of corruption." Thomas shook his hand firmly. "I didn't fight for my country just to let crooks like him steal it out from under us." As the SUV pulled away, the street felt quieter. The weight of what had almost happened settled in, but so did something else, a sense of victory. Thomas stepped back into his house, taking in the familiar space. His home, his sanctuary, and now it was his again. With a satisfied exhale, he picked up his coffee and took a slow, deliberate sip. Justice had been served, and he was just getting started.
The hospital hummed with the usual bustle, nurses wheeling patients, doctors consulting on rounds, the occasional announcement over the intercom. Dr. Malcolm Hayes, a renowned cardiac surgeon, had just wrapped up a grueling 7-hour operation that saved a young woman's life. Wiping sweat from his brow, he headed toward the break room for a much-needed cup of coffee. As he rounded the corner, he spotted a commotion near the hospital's front desk. 2 uniformed officers stood stiffly, one of them, a tall, broad-shouldered white man with a badge reading Officer Grayson, speaking tersely to the receptionist. His voice carried across the room. "Are you sure?" "Because we've got reports of someone matching the description causing trouble in this area." The receptionist, a young woman named Clara, was flustered but firm. "There's no one like that here, officer. This is a hospital, not a nightclub." Officer Grayson's eyes scanned the lobby, narrowing as they landed on Dr. Hayes. Tall, impeccably dressed in scrubs and a white coat, with his stethoscope still draped around his neck, Dr. Hayes hardly fit the image of a troublemaker. Yet Grayson's gaze lingered, his expression hardening. He nudged his partner and gestured subtly in Malcolm's direction. The tension was palpable. Malcolm sensed the unspoken challenge but kept his cool, sipping his coffee as he watched the officers approach. "Excuse me," Grayson said, his tone cold and clipped. "Can I see some ID?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "ID, I'm Dr. Hayes. I work here. Is there a problem?" Grayson crossed his arms. "We've got reports of a suspicious individual loitering around here. You match the description. Just show me some ID and we'll clear this up." Curiosity bubbled among the hospital staff, who had begun to gather at the edges of the lobby. Clara exchanged a worried glance with Malcolm, but he gave her a small nod, signaling her to stay calm. The tension crackled like static electricity. Malcolm reached into his pocket, pulling out his hospital badge and holding it out deliberately. "Here you go, Dr. Malcolm Hayes, Chief of Cardiac Surgery. Is this suspicious enough for you?" Grayson barely glanced at the badge before sneering. "How do I know this isn't fake? Let's step outside and sort this out." Malcolm chuckled softly, his deep, resonant voice carrying through the room. "Step outside, officer, this is my workplace. If there's sorting to be done, we can do it right here. Unless, of course, you're suggesting that I abandon my patients." Grayson's jaw tightened, his hand resting ominously on the holster at his hip. The air grew heavier with the unspoken implication. Malcolm's heart pounded, but his expression remained serene, a quiet strength radiating from him as he waited for Grayson's next move. The lobby seemed to hold its breath, every pair of eyes trained on the unfolding confrontation. Dr. Malcolm Hayes stood tall and unshaken, his presence commanding even as the tension around him swelled. Officer Grayson, however, leaned into his role with unsettling intensity. His partner, a younger officer named Martinez, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "Step outside, Dr. Hayes," Grayson repeated, his voice louder, more insistent. "I won't ask again." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, studying the officer with an unreadable expression. His calm, poised demeanor only seemed to inflame Grayson further. Finally, Malcolm spoke, his tone measured but resolute. "Officer, let me get this straight. You want me, a surgeon who just finished saving a life, to leave the hospital, my place of work, because I match a description you haven't shared, by the way." Grayson's mouth twitched in irritation. "We have a report of a black male acting suspiciously in the area. You match the height, build, and what skin color?" Malcolm interrupted smoothly, raising an eyebrow. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a pointed challenge. "Let me guess. The report didn't mention scrubs, a lab coat, or a stethoscope. Did it mention a scalpel in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other?" A few stifled chuckles rippled through the small crowd of hospital staff, breaking the oppressive silence. Grayson's face flushed, and he stepped closer, his posture bristling with barely contained anger. "Don't play games with me," he snarled. "This is official business. If you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to take you in." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. He set down his coffee cup on the counter with deliberate care and crossed his arms. "Take me in, for what, exactly?" "Drinking coffee." "Performing life-saving surgeries, or existing in this hospital while black." Martinez shifted uncomfortably again, clearing his throat as if he wanted to intervene, but Grayson cut him off with a sharp glance. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The audience was growing now. Nurses, interns, and even a couple of patients were watching with a mixture of concern and indignation. Clara, the receptionist, was furiously typing something on her computer, her face set in determination. "You're making it harder, officer," Malcolm said, his voice as steady as ever. "You walked into this hospital looking for trouble. Well, congratulations, you've found it. The question is, what are you going to do about it now that you've realized you're wrong?" Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but Malcolm held up a hand to stop him. "Before you answer, let me offer a word of caution. Every moment you stand here harassing me is a moment you're putting the lives of my patients at risk. Think carefully about your next move, officer. Are you prepared to explain this to my staff, to my patients, to your superiors?" The subtle but undeniable power in Malcolm's words hung heavy in the air. Grayson's expression faltered for a split second, but his pride and prejudice refused to let him back down. The silence that followed was electric. Officer Grayson's jaw tightened, his hand flexing over his holstered weapon as if it were a lifeline, but Malcolm didn't flinch. If anything, his unwavering calm only highlighted the officer's increasing aggression. "You're not in charge here, Doctor," Grayson barked, his voice echoing in the cavernous lobby. "This isn't your operating room. Now are you going to cooperate, or am I going to have to take you in for obstruction?" From behind the desk, Clara stood abruptly, her voice breaking the tension. "Officer, Dr. Hayes is one of the most respected surgeons in this hospital. Everyone here knows him. If you're accusing him of something, you'd better have more than a vague description to go on." Grayson shot her a glare that could have melted glass, but Clara didn't waver. Her bravery seemed to ignite something in the crowd of hospital staff. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group, and a few nurses nodded emphatically. Malcolm seized the moment. "Officer, it seems you're in a room full of witnesses who can vouch for me. Now, unless you're prepared to escalate this into a full-blown public incident, I suggest you reconsider your approach." Grayson's partner, Martinez, finally stepped forward. "Maybe we should take a second to—" "Not now," Grayson snapped, cutting him off. He turned his attention back to Malcolm, but the surgeon's confidence and the growing solidarity of the crowd were clearly unnerving him. Suddenly, a low voice came from behind the officers. "What's going on here?" All heads turned as Dr. Elizabeth Crane, the hospital's chief administrator, entered the lobby. Her sharp suit and piercing gaze commanded immediate respect. Her reputation as a no-nonsense leader was well known, and she looked every bit the part now as her eyes darted between Grayson and Malcolm. "Dr. Hayes," she said, her tone calm but firm, "is everything all right?" Malcolm gestured to Grayson. "It seems Officer Grayson here has some concerns about my presence in the hospital." Dr. Crane's expression darkened as she turned to the officers. "Officer Grayson, this is Dr. Malcolm Hayes, our chief cardiac surgeon. He's been with this hospital for over 10 years, and his record speaks for itself. Now, please explain why you feel the need to question one of my staff members in such an aggressive manner." Grayson's confidence faltered, but he quickly rallied. "We received a report of a suspicious individual, and he matched the description." "Of what, exactly?" Dr. Crane interrupted, her voice sharp. "A surgeon saving lives, because that's the only description that fits Dr. Hayes." Martinez looked as though he wanted to melt into the floor, but Grayson held his ground. "I was just doing my job, ma'am." Dr. Crane's lips thinned, "and I'm doing mine. This hospital is a place of healing and respect. Your behavior is neither professional nor appropriate, and I will not have my staff subjected to baseless harassment." Grayson bristled, his pride clearly stung. "Ma'am, I don't take orders from you." Malcolm, who had been silent during this exchange, stepped forward. "No, officer, but you do take orders from your department. I imagine they'll be very interested in hearing how you disrupted a hospital for no legitimate reason." At that moment, Clara cleared her throat and held up her phone. "By the way, this entire interaction has been recorded. I've already sent it to our hospital's legal team." Grayson's face drained of color. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted entirely out of his control. Officer Grayson's face shifted through a spectrum of emotions: anger, disbelief, and something uncomfortably close to fear. His partner, Officer Martinez, seemed torn between loyalty to his superior and the glaring reality of the situation. The crowd in the lobby watched intently, their quiet presence amplifying the weight of the moment. "Let me see that," Grayson snapped, reaching for Clara's phone. Clara pulled it back sharply, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Not a chance. This recording belongs to me, and I've already sent a copy to our legal department. You can explain your actions to them if you'd like." Dr. Malcolm Hayes watched the exchange with a calm exterior, but inside he was carefully considering his next move. He could see Grayson's ego teetering on the edge of collapse, but the officer wasn't ready to admit defeat, at least not yet. Grayson turned back to Malcolm, his jaw tight. "You think you're clever, don't you? But a phone recording doesn't tell the whole story. I was responding to a legitimate call, and I have the right to investigate any situation I deem suspicious." Suspicious, Malcolm's voice was a soft challenge, his words slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "I'd love to hear what exactly you found suspicious about me. Was it the scrubs, the badge, or was it simply the fact that I don't look like you?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Grayson's hand moved instinctively to his belt, his fingers brushing the radio as if he were considering calling for backup. But before he could act, Dr. Elizabeth Crane stepped forward, her commanding presence filling the room. "Officer Grayson," she said, her voice icy with authority, "let me remind you that you are in a hospital, a place where people come to receive care, not to be harassed. Dr. Hayes is not only an exemplary surgeon, but also a respected leader in this community. If you have any evidence to support your so-called investigation, present it now. Otherwise, I strongly suggest you leave before you dig yourself into an even deeper hole." Grayson's eyes darted to his partner, but Martinez was no longer making any effort to mask his discomfort. "She's right," Martinez said quietly. "We don't have anything to go on. Maybe we should just—" "Quiet," Grayson barked, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The cracks in his armor were widening, and the pressure of the growing crowd was becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Malcolm stepped to the center of the lobby, his every movement deliberate and controlled. He raised his voice, addressing both the officers and the gathered staff. "This isn't just about me. What's happening here is a reflection of a larger problem, one that too many people in this country face every day. Prejudice like this doesn't just harm individuals, it erodes trust in the very institutions meant to protect and serve." The staff nodded, their quiet support emboldening him. Malcolm turned his attention back to Grayson, his gaze piercing. "You came here expecting to find a criminal, but instead, you found a community standing together. So, Officer Grayson, the question is, what kind of man are you going to be when you walk out of this building? Will you admit your mistake, or will you let your pride drag you down further?" Grayson's face burned with humiliation, but he said nothing. For the first time, it seemed as though the weight of his actions was beginning to sink in. Martinez stepped closer to him, his voice low but firm. "Let's go, Grayson. This isn't worth it." Grayson hesitated, his hand still hovering near his radio. The crowd watched, waiting to see if he would relent or escalate. The room seemed frozen in time as Officer Grayson stood at a crossroads. His pride and his authority hung in delicate balance against the sheer weight of reason, evidence, and the resolute crowd that had formed against him. Every eye was on him, every face silently demanding that he make his next move carefully. His partner, Officer Martinez, leaned in closer. Grayson let it go. "You're making it worse." Grayson's lips tightened into a thin line, his hand still resting near his radio, but he wasn't deaf to the growing murmurs of disapproval from the staff and patients surrounding him. The reality of the moment began to dawn on him. He wasn't in control anymore. Dr. Malcolm Hayes, standing just feet away, refused to look away or back down. His calm demeanor had been Malcolm's shield throughout this ordeal, but now it became his sword. He took a step closer to Grayson, his voice steady but sharp. "Officer, the time for excuses has passed. Everyone in this room has seen your actions for what they are. You came here expecting to intimidate someone who had done nothing wrong, and when confronted with the truth, you refused to listen. Now the entire hospital is watching. What happens next is entirely up to you." Grayson's eyes flicked nervously to Clara, who still held her phone up, the recording feature unmistakable. "You don't have the whole story," he muttered defensively. "I was doing my job." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass and profile. And just so we're clear, you failed on both counts today." At that moment, Dr. Elizabeth Crane stepped forward, her authoritative presence slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "Officer Grayson," she said firmly, "this hospital will not tolerate any behavior that jeopardizes the safety and well-being of our staff or patients. If you don't leave immediately, I will personally ensure that this incident is reported to your superiors, complete with evidence from our security cameras and the statements of every witness here." The mention of security cameras sent a visible ripple of unease through Grayson. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the small black domes mounted on the ceiling, their blinking red lights silently confirming Dr. Crane's words. His bravado cracked further, his posture sagging slightly under the weight of his own folly. Before Grayson could respond, Martinez took a decisive step forward. "She's right," he said, his voice louder and more resolute than before. "We're done here." He turned to Malcolm and nodded. "Dr. Hayes, I'm sorry for the misunderstanding." The sincerity in Martinez's voice surprised Malcolm, but he gave a small nod in return. "Acknowledging the mistake is a good first step." Malcolm replied, his tone measured, "I hope it won't be the last." Grayson opened his mouth to argue, but Martinez shot him a pointed look that silenced him. "Let's go," Martinez said, his voice firm. "Now." Grayson hesitated, his gaze flicking between Malcolm, the crowd, and his partner. Finally, with a barely contained sneer, he turned on his heel and stalked toward the exit. Martinez followed, offering another apologetic glance to the assembled staff before disappearing through the sliding glass doors. As the doors closed behind them, the tension in the room broke like a snapped wire. A collective exhale swept through the crowd, followed by scattered applause. Clara set her phone down, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since the encounter began. As the sliding doors closed behind the officers, Dr. Malcolm Hayes turned back to the gathered crowd. The tension had evaporated, but an unmistakable energy of solidarity and resolve remained. Malcolm, ever the calm presence, raised a hand to quiet the murmurs. "Thank you," he said, his voice clear and resonant. "Not just for standing with me, but for standing against something much bigger than this moment." Clara, still visibly shaken, spoke up. "I'm so sorry, Dr. Hayes. I should have called for help sooner." Malcolm gave her a reassuring smile. "You did exactly what you should have, Clara. You stood your ground, and you showed courage." "That's what matters." Dr. Elizabeth Crane stepped forward, her sharp gaze sweeping across the staff. "This incident wasn't just about Dr. Hayes. It was about all of us, about how we respond to injustice when it shows up at our doorstep. Today, we proved that this hospital is a place where we look out for one another." The staff nodded in agreement, but Malcolm wasn't finished. "What happened here is part of a larger problem," he said, his tone thoughtful but firm. "This wasn't the first time I've been profiled, and it likely won't be the last. But each time we have a choice. Do we let it pass, or do we use it as an opportunity to demand better?" Clara, emboldened by his words, raised her hand slightly. "What can we do?" "I mean, beyond what we just did." Malcolm looked at her, his expression one of quiet determination. "We start by documenting everything. This recording, the security footage, witness statements. We send it to the police department and the media if necessary. We hold people accountable, not just to punish, but to educate." Dr. Crane nodded. "I'll be speaking to the hospital's legal team and drafting a formal complaint to the department. But we should also look inward. Let's use this as an opportunity to reinforce our own commitment to equity and inclusion through training, policy reviews, and making sure every staff member feels safe and respected. The staff murmured in agreement, a renewed sense of purpose settling over the group. One of the nurses, a young woman named Rachel, stepped forward hesitantly. "Dr. Hayes, I just want to say what you did was incredible. The way you stayed calm, even when he was so aggressive, I don't think I could have done that." Malcolm smiled warmly. "It wasn't easy, Rachel, but I've learned that anger, while justified, doesn't always get the results we need. Sometimes the most powerful response is to remain composed and let the truth speak for itself." As the staff began to disperse, Malcolm turned to Dr. Crane. "Thank you for stepping in when you did. That could have gone a very different way." Dr. Crane placed a hand on his shoulder. "You handled yourself brilliantly, Malcolm. I'm proud to have you on this team." Just as Malcolm was about to head back to his office, Clara approached him with her phone. "Dr. Hayes, there's something else I think you should see." She played the video she had recorded. In it, Grayson's every action, his hostility, his baseless accusations, and his reluctance to leave, was laid bare. Clara had also captured Malcolm's poised responses, and the moment when Martinez intervened to de-escalate. It was a clear and damning record of the events. "We should share this," Clara said. "The world needs to see what happened here." Malcolm hesitated. He knew the video could spark a broader conversation, but it could also bring backlash and unwanted attention. After a moment of thought, he nodded. "Share it with the hospital's legal team first. If they give the green light, we'll decide how to release it." The video from Clara's phone made its way through the proper channels, first to the hospital's legal team, then to the local police department, and finally to the public. Within days, it was the subject of widespread discussion on social media and local news. The footage was undeniable, capturing every moment of Officer Grayson's hostility and baseless accusations, as well as Dr. Malcolm Hayes' dignified and composed response. The public's reaction was swift and overwhelming. Community leaders called for an investigation into Grayson's conduct, while activists rallied around the hospital, praising its staff for standing up against injustice. Within a week, the police department announced that Grayson had been placed on administrative leave pending a full inquiry. For Malcolm, the aftermath of the incident brought both challenges and opportunities. His face became synonymous with resilience and grace in the face of prejudice, drawing attention far beyond the hospital's walls. Invitations for interviews poured in from national news outlets, and Malcolm found himself thrust into a role he hadn't sought, that of a spokesperson for change. At first, Malcolm hesitated. He had always been dedicated to his patients, not the spotlight, but the more he thought about the incident, the more he realized the power of his platform. If sharing his story could help prevent others from facing similar treatment, then perhaps it was worth stepping out of his comfort zone. In a live interview with a prominent news network, Malcolm spoke candidly about the experience. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident," he said. "It's part of a systemic issue that requires all of us to confront our biases and hold ourselves accountable. This isn't just about one officer or one hospital. It's about creating a society where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, no matter their race or profession." Meanwhile, within the hospital, the incident spurred meaningful change. Under Dr. Elizabeth Crane's leadership, the hospital implemented new training programs focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Staff members were encouraged to share their experiences and ideas for fostering a more inclusive environment, and the hospital's commitment to these values became a model for others in the community. As for Officer Grayson, the investigation into his conduct concluded with consequences that were both swift and impactful. He was suspended without pay and ordered to complete an extensive program on bias and de-escalation techniques. While some in the community demanded harsher penalties, Malcolm advocated for education and reform over retribution. "I don't believe in tearing people down," Malcolm said in a follow-up interview. "I believe in building a better future, one where people like Officer Grayson can learn from their mistakes and become part of the solution." In the months that followed, the hospital became a beacon of hope and progress. Patients, staff, and community members alike drew inspiration from the incident and its aftermath, seeing it as a reminder that change was possible when people stood together. For Malcolm, Life gradually returned to its normal rhythm of surgeries, consultations, and late-night coffee runs. But he carried the experience with him, using it as a reminder of his own strength and the strength of those who had stood by him. One day, as he passed through the lobby where the confrontation had unfolded, he paused for a moment. The space was bustling as always, filled with the sounds of healing and hope. Malcolm smiled, knowing that, in some small way, the hospital and the world was better for what had happened.